We're recording.
Wonderful. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. I'm very blessed to have an opportunity to speak to you guys today. I'm sorry that you guys don't have Abuna Anthony Paul with you. It's always such a great blessing to be able to hear him speak. And so you guys got the real short end of the stick here. I hope that I can do this topic justice. I know that you guys have been covering practical spirituality from Abuna Athanasios Iskandar's book. And we're going to be doing chapter 3 today, which is focused on the discipline of the senses, of the five senses. I thought that it was actually very fortuitous and providential that we're speaking about this particular topic today, because the gospel of today was the Samaritan woman. And we see that there are some church fathers that will actually speak about the five husbands that the Samaritan woman had as the five senses, and the five senses that were misused, how it was that they were supposed to be directed towards God, towards worship, towards Christ and his glorification, and how they were instead directed towards the world. And the whole gospel is filled with kinds of imagery like this. And this particular one was from today as well, so that you could see that even with the most basic things, when we see the need for water, so that there's something that you can taste, something that you could feel, he directs her to the living water instead. Her mind is on a physical place of worship. Do we worship here? Do we worship in Jerusalem? Where is it that we're supposed to worship? And he says that's the physical, that's the sense part. You're supposed to worship in spirit and truth. And so he's constantly redirecting. And even when he speaks to his disciples at the very end, and they ask him, or he says that I have meat to eat of which you don't know. And they all ask one another, did anyone give him anything to eat? They're always thinking about the senses, and he's trying to redirect that so that it's used in its proper fashion. And that's hopefully what it is that we're going to be getting to today. I know that Abuna Anthony is also doing a Bible study for you on the Gospel of John. And so if you pay attention to the rest of the gospel, this particular gospel is very, very heavy on the five senses and how it is that they're supposed to be directed appropriately to God. And so let's get started with the discipline of the senses. So this is Theophan the Recluse, and he has this quote that says, "Christians who are attentive toward themselves call all the senses the windows of the soul. If these windows are opened, all the inner warmth will leave. Our senses are the physical gateways by which we interact with the world. If we use them appropriately, they can lead us to Christ. In our brokenness, they're often redirected elsewhere. We enjoy the immediate pleasures of the world, having become so accustomed to seeing how every part of us can be used to seek out God and to find our joy in him. This is what man was originally intended for, to share in the joy of God with every part of our being, not just our mind, not just the sort of ethereal, abstract prayer that we might have, but really us as a complete unit, as body, soul, and spirit. That's how it is that we're supposed to be worshiping God. Unfortunately, we're all too aware of how corrupted everything has become, that we don't even realize that this is what the intended use of these things were to begin with. And Lent is a really wonderful time for us to be able to redirect our efforts and to try to reestablish the foundation in our minds and hearts as to what it is that we're supposed to be doing. This isn't just an exercise of the mind, as though we're split personalities. Your body is very much a part of who you are, and its discipline is crucial for us to be able to seek out God in truth. It's not merely an exercise of closing off everything, right? So there's this image that Theophan the Recluse gives that Abuna cites in the beginning of this chapter here, that he says that the senses are like the windows to the house, and the mind is like the owner of the house. And so he says, if you're letting everything in, that's because all the windows are open. Well, if you think about it, if you just close all of the windows, if you do that in an actual physical space, like your own house, if you close all the windows and you constantly keep them closed, that's not very good, right? You still need to air things out. Things need to be exposed to the outside at some point. But those things have to be done in moderation. And that's hopefully what it is that we're going to be talking about today. These senses are not evil, right? Your body is not an evil thing. So your use of the sense of sight, for example, is not intrinsically an evil thing, and it shouldn't be thought of that way. And so we have to learn how to use these things appropriately for their intended purpose. And that's hopefully what we're going to be touching on briefly here today. So the first thing that Abuna covers is the discipline of the eyes. And he gives two wonderful quotes that Christ spoke in the Gospel of St. Matthew. He says, "The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is sound, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is not sound, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness?" And he also says, "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." The lust spurred on by what the eyes behold is at an all-time high in the history of the world as a whole. It used to be that that people dressed much more modestly. People were generally covered up. And even if there was someone that was dressed in a more revealing or provocative fashion, you'd have to be right in front of them to be able to see them. There could still be an element of shame on the part of the person looking that would make them look away. And today, that's certainly not the case because it's everywhere. And it's particularly in our pockets, on our phones. I'm sure people have mentioned this to you so many times over the years, but these images have pervaded every part of our daily lives. And it used to be, like when Abuna wrote this book, probably now close to 2 decades ago, that the internet wasn't even as developed as it is now with the kinds of horrific things that you'd be able to find on there. Now it's everywhere. Even if you're trying to avoid it, it's everywhere. And so you could look at something like Instagram Reels or TikTok just for a few moments, and if you know you're just watching videos or something and it's something that's interesting or intriguing to you, just wait until it scrolls and something inappropriate is bound to come up very, very quickly. And so that is something that we're experiencing, like I said, at an all-time high right now. The other thing that's happening that's very common with our youth, especially here in America, I assume that this is probably true for Canada as well. But there's plenty of this sort of sending photos back and forth to one another. And it used to be that people were doing it on Snapchat. I don't know what the app is that people are using now for that. But again, it's become such a part of our culture that we all know that it exists and we recognize it. And this applies, by the way, for both boys and girls, for men and women. This isn't an issue that's only relegated to one side or the other. And I think that was something that we've come to be able to understand a little bit more in depth now, because I think there were certain assumptions that were being made before that this is strictly an issue for men, but clearly not. It's both. And even the dressing provocatively is not intended to just be directed towards the girls. That's something that the guys do as well. And so we have a number of sins of the eyes that are listed off in this book. There's lust, there's envy, there's watching violence, there's looking at delicious foods, and then there's seeking out after cars and clothes and houses. Let's try to delve into that a little bit more. So the wandering of the eye is such a powerful temptation. Look at the prophet David, for example, who's said to have had the heart of God. All it took for him to fall into this was to look at a married woman at the wrong time. And that resulted in him becoming a murderer and an adulterer. Don't think that you are stronger than David in your faith, or that your character to challenge these temptations is so strong that you can do it head on. we like to toe this line and think that we're going to come out victors on the other side. So say to yourself, for example, I'll allow myself to look at some things, but I won't look at certain things, or I'll only click on this one, or I won't say no if they send it to me. I didn't ask, right? And it's not only sexual lust that we encounter through the eye. We can envy others for what it is that they have. And again, I want to make this very clear. The lust of the eye is, when you look at someone like that from that sort of temptation standpoint, again, because we are a hypersexualized society, this seems to be sort of the big sin that we have in our mind. But the rest of this stuff doesn't even phase us, right? Maybe many of us don't even think that this is really a very serious thing. So that if you envy someone for having something, if you look at them in envy, or if you want something that isn't yours in an inappropriate manner, we don't usually think of that as being on par with the look of lust, right? But these are the sins of sight, and we have to see how all of these factor in and contribute to this becoming deterrents from our spiritual lives. We can envy others for what they have and hate them for the mere fact that they have it. That's what envy means, right? It's not just that you see that someone has like a nice car or a book or an iPad or something like that, and you say like, "Oh, I wish I had that as well." It's that you're angry that this person has it, right? You're upset about the fact that they have some sort of success that you don't have, and so that is a problem. Aside from that, the watching of violence has become absolutely just a complete part of our society. So that if it doesn't even have to be movies anymore, right? If anyone's watching Netflix and you're streaming all of these different kinds of shows that people are binging on, there's all these terrible shows that are out there right now, that are inundated with this. And because we're so accustomed to seeing violent images, we don't even think twice about it anymore. We don't think that there's any sort of an issue watching violence, watching gory movies, or seeing something atrocious from the news. Um, and beyond that as well, not just the violence, but the looking at delicious foods. This has become really very popular now. And again, I think that most of us wouldn't even consider this to be an issue. So again, if you're sitting there on Instagram, for example, and you see people putting on food recipes, putting them together, and then you get to see how it is that it turns out. And especially during Lent, that's a huge problem, because you can see all the different kinds of foods that you wish that you could have, and you're wondering why all of these things are popping up on your phone now. And beyond that as well, it's the same way that we try to deal with one another when we make like a nice meal, or we go out to a fancy restaurant. We'll all take photos and then we post them online, because we want to show off. We want to show people what it is that we're eating here. And so it's funny, because we kind of downplay the role of food, but then we're so quick to watch this kind of stuff and to share it with other people, because intrinsically we know that there's something deeper to this idea of food, and something in delicious food that goes beyond just what it is that the image is showing here. Aside from that, with this last point about cars and clothes and houses, during Lent, if you try to be mindful of things, and you see how it is that your mind is kind of wandering during Lent, you'll notice that this is a particular time of the year where we have this spirit of acquisitiveness. We want to obtain as many things as possible. So take, for example, how much you've shopped online in the last few weeks. You could see what your purchases were like on Amazon or any of those kinds of sites, whatever. And it just becomes this sort of like endless shopping, because we are constantly looking for something. We're looking for objects to be able to fill something that we feel is missing inside of us. And this happens with all kinds of things, like especially for a particular subset of people. They really like to look at cars and nice cars, and this is sort of a big thing. And so you see a nice car drive by, or they can just hear it drive by, and suddenly everyone's looking, everyone's watching, everyone wants to see what's happening there. Or if you're older, you live in a house, or say you live in an apartment, you're constantly looking for houses, or you live in a house and you're constantly looking to upgrade, something like this, right? It's all so much energy that's wasted. I'm not saying that some of these things are intrinsically evil. It's the fact that we don't even moderate ourselves. There should be a time and a place for these things. And again, this is what it is that the church tries to impart for us. So that if we have a particular time of the year where we're abstaining from eating particular kinds of food, which turns out to be the majority of the year, uh, but if that doesn't mean that when we're actually partaking of these things that there's something evil about it intrinsically, right? Looking at nice cars or watching recipes of food being put together isn't intrinsically bad. It's the when and the why that's important, and that's something that is so fundamental to Lent. Is that we're trying to learn moderation. We're trying to learn how it is that we can pull back from what we are naturally inclined to do, because we don't realize how inclined we are to these things, how we let our eyes wander, even if they're not going to things that we think are sort of the worst things that they could go to. So, like gory images or lustful images or something like this. We don't usually pay attention to what it is that we're allowing in through the senses. And so there's a discipline of the eyes that must take place. One should not only train his eyes not to look with lust at anyone or anything, but should also train the eyes to see God in everyone and in everything. This is what the use of the eye is supposed to be, right? You're supposed to be able to look at everyone and everything around you and see God in whatever that person, whoever that person is, or whatever the thing is, right? That's why we were given this gift of sight, so that we can look around and marvel and see the beauty of God's work, the beauty of God's creation. And so I challenge anyone, including myself, to think about how many things I've seen today and how many times I've thought to myself, that I was using this as a point of contemplation or meditation on trying to see God in that. Saint Macarius the Great, who is an incredibly wonderful, wonderful saint, and his feast day, by the way, is tomorrow, for those that don't know. He says, "Truly the interior man looks on all human beings with pure eyes and finds joy in the whole world." That's what the sense of sight is supposed to impart. Now, you can see here that it takes certain qualities, right? The interior man looks on all human beings. So it's a change that has to happen inside of someone, so that your eye, if your eye is single, like when Christ says that, if you have a singular vision, if you have a single eye, then what it is that you're looking at in its essence always is going to be trying to find where God is, right? Because that's always what your vision is. That's always what you're looking out for. But that comes from the interior man, and it takes a development of pure eyes that Christ imparts to us by grace, as a result of that, uh, you're able to find joy in the whole world. Now it's funny because we spend all of our time trying to find joy in obtaining all of these things, or any of the pleasures of the world that we're looking upon, and you'll always find that you're so empty, regardless, right? Regardless of whatever it is, regardless of how amazing it is, whatever it is that you're looking at, the most beautiful scenes are so ephemeral. They just pass away so quickly, and you don't find joy in them because you don't find Christ in them, because you're not looking for Christ in them, right? And so if you have this, the developed interior man who has Christ in him, who has Christ in his vision, who can see Christ in other people, in other things, who can see Christ in a sunset, in a flower, in a car, who can see Christ in other people, people that you wouldn't normally anticipate. Like, I think we like to think that we could see Christ in the saints, which is true, but we can see him in everybody. We should be able to see him in little kids and people of different faiths, in all kinds of people. You should be able to see Christ's image in them, and that's clearly not what it is that we're trained to do, right? And so this takes training. One of the beautiful things that we have, that was offered to the world from our country, was monasticism, and the monks are really incredibly well trained in trying to practice this on a very regular basis. Not every monk, right? Just like not every Christian is a perfect Christian, but those that have given us something to be able to focus on, to learn from, we see how it is that they practice these things. And they're not just practicing them just for the sake of practicing them, right? They're not just out there being these sorts of athletes just because they want to see how far they can push it. It's not like they're in a spiritual gym and they want to see how much they can bench spiritually. That's not the point, right? The point is that they're out there so that they can learn for themselves and for the community at large. What is it that we are supposed to be doing so that we can grow in Christ more and more? And so there's this story that is in this chapter that's a very interesting story that I don't think that many of us would give very much thought to, which is that a monk was sent by his superior to Alexandria on an errand. When he came back, the other monks asked him, "What's Alexandria like?" And he answered them, "I did not purpose to look at anything in Alexandria." Now that's kind of funny, right? Is that he goes to a city, and then the great takeaway that's from there is that he didn't look at anything. Now, the reason why I say that that's so interesting is because there's clearly a reason why this was written down that's beyond what, especially when we're reading the Desert Fathers. You might read a line very quickly and then you'll say like, oh, that's very interesting, and then you just kind of move on to the next one very quickly. But this has been inherited through the generations for 1700 years for a reason, right? There's something that is intrinsically amazing about this. It's that when you go, do you have the foresight to have the self-control, to have that prayer develop inside of you, to where if you need to go somewhere on an errand. Notice that this guy isn't just going so that he could go explore and test himself and test to see how good his self-control is. He's sent there on an errand, and he says, I'm going to go with prayer in my heart, with Christ there with me, so that I just go and I focus on this one thing, because my eye is single, my mind is single. That's all it is that I have to do, is just focus on that one thing. I'm going to go and do that, and then I'm out of there. That's incredible. I don't know very many people that could do that. I personally, I don't think that I could really do that, even if I really had it in my mind to try, because our eyes wander so readily. But this is this kind of self-control that they wanted, not just for the sake of self-control, but so that they could always keep Christ in mind, and so that they also knew that maybe if they weren't at that level, because we think, okay, like this is the highest level that someone could be at, that they can go somewhere and not look at anything. But there's an even higher level than that, which Abuna also recounts in this chapter, that he says that there's a woman that was basically not wearing very many clothes, that walked by a group of monks, and all of the monks looked away, and the elder monk didn't look away. And the other monks looked at the elder monk, and he said, how is it that you couldn't look away? Like, what is that? And their mind is, for sure, this elder monk didn't look away because he fell into lust. And he looked and he said, don't you see how beautiful God's work is? He wasn't struck by lust, right? That's the level that's even higher than what it is that we just spoke about before. He wasn't struck by that lust. He saw God in his creation. Now, that's not something that you should just tempt yourself with, because these things come in stages, right? If you can't do the first stage, don't think that you're just going to magically jump to the final stage and say, oh, I can look at everything with a pure eye. The story that we see from that monk that said that he didn't look at anything in Alexandria is there so that it can show us that there are levels, right? And that these levels can be traversed with a guide. That's how it is that we go through it, so that we could say, look, I'm not perfect. I know that I need self-control. I'm not at that level. What is it that I can do? And that's the level that's there. And that's why it's put for us in these kinds of stories. Don't fool yourself. Don't think that you could pull something like this off tomorrow. You'll think, yes, I could be in the midst of a terrible environment, but I'm strong enough not to sin. That not only comes with a tremendous amount of asceticism, but most importantly, by the grace of the Holy Spirit. Without the Holy Spirit, we're done. We're toast. Don't tempt God. if you put yourself in a position where you shouldn't be, and you think that it'll be all right because God will protect you, and that you're just going to do your part, but God will protect you, and you're willingly and willfully putting yourself in that position, you're tempting God. Um, what we should do is train ourselves to see God in everything. If we see a beautiful person, don't let your mind wander and think about the person and what could be with them and how you could be with them and this sort of thing. Think of God who formed this person, who gave us the concept of beauty to begin with, because God is beauty himself. Another tool that we have is to think of the passion of the Christ when we see certain objects that are around us. So Buna says in the chapter, if you see a piece of rope, for example, think about how Christ was bound by those ropes on his way to the cross. Or if you see a nail, think of how he was nailed to the cross. And we see nails everywhere. If you actually start paying attention, they're all over your house, right? In short, we're supposed to redirect everything towards him. Our mind constantly has to be practicing thinking of him. We should also recognize that due to the sheer volume of lustful images that exist now, and the ease with which we can access them on our phones, these things have developed into true addictions for some people, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. And some of these recommendations that are being put out here today aren't necessarily going to apply so easily in those cases. It's important, especially if one recognizes that they're in that kind of a situation, to seek out help from a trusted source, from a real spiritual guide, and often in conjunction with a therapist as well, because these things are not easy to deal with. The shackles that have bound all of us are so they're so powerful that if we think that we can just walk out of a talk like this, for example, and say, well, we're in Lent, I'm just going to pray to God for about 26 seconds, and I'm sure that I'll be able to pull this off. You're going to find yourself in a bad spot. I'm not saying that God can't work miracles and make these kinds of things disappear, but by and large, there is a reason why these things exist as trials in our lives. And we have to find a way to be able to work through it in the appropriate set fashion. And so that's the discipline of the eyes. There are sins of the ears. Actually, before I go on here, I do want to say that these kinds of chapters are always a little bit troubling, because they are meant to give indications for all of us about what it is that we're doing that we're not being mindful of, so that we could be more mindful of them. Sometimes it functions the other way, right? So sometimes when you're reading through chapters like this, or if you're listening to a talk and someone starts speaking about these different kinds of things, it engages our mind, and then suddenly we're actually starting to think about some of these things rather than fight against them. And so I really do ask that you try to remain motivated here and keep focused on why it is that we're in this class. And it's not just so that we can go and catalog a bunch of sins. The sins of the ears. Again, this has become so prevalent in our society that we don't even really think that it's that big of a deal, and we don't see why it is that it would affect us. And so you could see here bad music with bad lyrics, or violent music, or music videos, right? The first three here go together, and this goes without saying. What's funny is that when Abuna wrote this book, they didn't have the awful, over-the-top, explicit lyrics in the mainstream like we do now. Obviously, those songs existed when we were younger, but now it's so prevalent that it's really kind of the only thing that people talk about. Look, for example, how many people know about Cardi B's music from this last year, or this terrifyingly terrible music that came out in the music video from the last few weeks with this guy, Lil Nas X, right? Everyone's talking about it. It's in the news. Everyone, Nike's talking about it. It's in news articles from yesterday. It's such a big thing, right? It's a very, very misguided assumption that we can listen to things and not have them affect us. Like, we tell ourselves it's just music. I listen for the beat, or I just want to hear what everyone else is listening to so that I can be aware, or whatever, right? Um, these things are so anything that we allow, and it's funny because once we have this in our minds, we see how invasive this kind of stuff is. Uh, One of the few things that happens to us that we're very aware of is that we can easily get a song stuck in our head, and it can be in there sometimes for hours or days, and unfortunately sometimes for weeks, and it'll just keep replaying over and over and over again. Um, and that can happen because we just allow something in that shouldn't even be there to begin with, right? I'm not saying that all music is bad. I'm not saying all of this stuff should just sort of be written off, but you should be very careful about what it is that you're letting in, and don't think that now because you're older and you're not in high school or in junior high or something like that, that these things aren't a big deal, and you'll be able to discern what it is that is a problem and not, and you can fight these demons off just by sheer willpower and thinking to yourself, oh, I'm not going to let this affect me. I know that this is ridiculous. Um, I hear bad words all over the place. What difference does it make if I'm hearing it from there? That's the kind of testing of God that we do all the time. The other thing that was particularly uh, rampant at the time when Buna was writing this book was that it became very popular for people to listen to heretical talks, right? Sermons from other um, denominations that don't really have a very good foundation in Christ. I'm not saying everybody is like that, but it takes a lot of discernment to be able to see where the good is and where it's not so good, right? It's very hard, especially when your footing isn't so sturdy in the church, to go and listen to what other people are saying and be able to distinguish the good from the bad, because you think that it'd be very straightforward, right? All the key terms are there. They say Jesus Christ, they say love, they say forgiveness. Um, but we should really be mindful of what we're allowing in. If we have a wrong assumption of who God is, or how he sees me, or how I should approach him, it can really mess with my spiritual life. And that's unfortunately been the case for many, many people, where they form an idea of God as a wrathful, spiteful God who reigns through rules and regulations and just wants you to be miserable by not being, quote unquote, yourself. It happens. And many people are so deeply hurt by this. And many people end up leaving the church because of this, because this is the mindset that they have, right? And this is something that we'll find in many untrusted sources. But beyond that, it's become now a lot more rampant that people are just talking about sort of self-help things. So I won't even mention Christ or anything like that. We'll just talk about abstract things. We'll say that they're Christian pastors, but they'll come out, they'll speak about love and forgiveness and this sort of thing, but it's not grounded in Christ. It's just grounded in, sort of the abstract. And so at some point, people start saying, well, okay, then what's the point? What's the point of being involved with orthodoxy or going to church or any of these things? I could just be a good person. I could just be a good moral person, right? These tenets apply for everybody, regardless of whether or not Christ is involved. And it's that kind of thinking that's so dangerous for us that, again, we toy with. And it is as equally dangerous as the things that were listed off earlier here, right? The bad music with the violence and the music videos. It's anything that you allow into yourself that doesn't have its foundation in Christ, that isn't leading you towards Christ. That's a problem. Now, I'm not saying that every single thing that you're supposed to be listening to from a music standpoint has to be some sort of faith-based thing or church hymns or something like that. I personally would never be able to do that, and I don't think that there's any church father that's really advocated for that to that degree, right? You can listen to music and find God in music, right? You can hear such really beautiful things and contemplate and meditate on that and find God in that, if you have the right mindset, right? If you're listening with the appropriate ears. But our ears are, again, trained to listen to really problematic things. And one of the things that we find that's really rampant in our culture, especially, is gossip. Gossip happens a lot, a lot. It's not only the joking assumption and characterization that used to be made that girls do this, and girls are the ones that are going out and they're gossiping. Guys do this a lot too. And if you're not aware of it, think about the kinds of conversations that you've had in the last week, right? You could dress it up however it is that you want. It's still gossip. If you're speaking about people behind their backs, it will lead to judging them. If you find out that someone else is speaking about you behind your back and you want to find out what it is that they're saying, and you lend an ear to a quote unquote friend who's coming to tell you what it is that people are saying about you behind your back, see how much anger builds up inside of you, and hurt and hostility that builds up against this person that you heard was speaking about you behind your back, right? It's this kind of stuff that we let in through our ears that takes us away from God. And it's funny because I don't think that many of us would think about that, right? If I heard that someone was speaking about me behind my back, and a friend came and wanted to share that with me, I might think that I'm, wise and discerning, and let me hear what it is that they're saying, so that I could go out and I can forgive them, and I could be mindful towards them, and figure out whatever it is that the problem is. But more often than not, that just triggers us and makes us feel very upset about things. And so you have to be wise about that. And just like the monk then in the earlier story didn't try not to look at anything. This is what it is that we're supposed to try to be doing, right? It's not that you don't try to hear anything, uh, but the things that you allow in, the things that you're listening to, be aware of what it is that there is. And if you have an opportunity to stop it, and it's not leading you to Christ, it's not leading you to have joy, it's not leading you to have love, it's not leading you towards forgiveness, it's not leading you towards God, then it's leading you away from it, right? And the same thing happens with flattery as well. We're often rather insecure in ourselves, and we really want to hear people speak well about us. And so you'll even do things where you fake things about yourself just so that people can say nice things about you at church or in your circle of friends, or whatever. Flattery is one of those things that is so critical that we don't think of as being a sin of the ear, because it's someone else that's saying it, and we'll just be like, oh, thank you so much, like, thank God. But inside of yourself, when someone says something good, it really sort of inflames you, and it says like, oh, that's great, I'm so glad that they're looking at me in this really positive light, right? And so we have to have discipline of the ears. This is a perfect time to do this, right? Lent is so much a critical time for us to be able to say that we can very easily fast from bad music, we can fast from gossip, we can fast from spending long times on the phone. um, and you could do other things, right? You can listen to hymns, you can listen to sermons. And what Abuna advocates here is that you could think of Christ's passion when you hear certain things. So he says, like, for example, if you hear that something is knocking like this, you could think of when it was that they were hammering away at the nails for Christ. This is pretty common for us to know how it is that we should deal with this. But you have to be aware of whether or not you're even falling into these things to begin with, right? Ask yourself if you gossip, and be honest about it. Be honest with yourself. Um, if you need recommendations in terms of sermons or hymns that you want to listen to, ask Abuna for something um, that's from a trustworthy source. That it's not only that, but it can also benefit you very directly. There's lots of things out there that they're good, but maybe they're not what you're supposed to be listening to at that moment, right? So that if you're struggling with a particular passion, and someone comes and says, "Hey, I want you to hear this really great talk on Christology." Uh, yeah, it's great. The Christology talk might be great, but there might be something else that's happening at that point that you need support in. And so it's very good for us to be able to find that kind of support by allowing other things that are positive in, so that we can hear the appropriate things. Um, Again, be very mindful of what it is that you listen to. Sins of the tongue. This is funny. It's funny because if you ask someone what the sins of the tongue are, probably the first thing that people will say is speaking badly about others or swearing or any of those things. And the first thing that Abuna puts, and rightly so, is this constant enamorment with gourmet foods, right? Despite the fact that we as a church fast so much, I don't think people really pay attention to how much food controls us. Again, look at how much time we spend watching those videos or looking at posts on Instagram about it. Um, Food is so critical for us. Um, and we spend so much time on it. We spend so much time so that people drive to different places and very long distances so that they could just go and try something, or they'll stand in long lines just so that they could try something. And then, kind of what it is that they're going for, and they'll do this nonstop, right? I mean, people just go nonstop and try to get their fill this way. It's an obsession with food that is taking us away from being obsessed with the food of God, right? Like the bread of heaven, the kind of stuff that we should be focusing on, which is Christ Himself. Just like what it is that He said in the gospel today, that He has meat to eat of that we don't know. This is really one, I think, that gets relegated off to the side, and we say like, okay, I think I understand fasting, I understand its benefits, and I'll do it. We kind of break it sometimes. Maybe I'm not going to fast everything. I'll just kind of make that decision on my own because I get it, right? I kind of get the process. And what's funny is that when you go and you read the Desert Fathers, these huge giants that did this all of their lives, and they wrote these things for our benefit. One of the things, the very first thing that they focus on is food. Uh, and that's the very first thing that we just toss to the side, and we say like, okay, that's not really important. Let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to pride. Let's get to lust. Let's get to envy. Let's get to the good stuff. The food stuff isn't really the important thing. But they see that the foundation of all of this, of the ascetical life, of being able to position yourself in such a way that you would be more open to having Christ within you, so that He is the one where you get your fill. That's in our struggle with food. And so, again, we have to be mindful of this to the degree that we can recognize that those things that we think that are just so basic, that we had that covered when we were 12 years old, are going to remain the foundational point for the rest of our lives. Other sins of the tongue are swearing and lying, gossiping, talkativeness, and inappropriate advice, right? We're a very talkative generation when we're not really speaking about very much of anything. Look how much texting happens in a day, phone calls and hangouts, all of this stuff, right? Just a constant stream of talking. We crave constant input, and we speak idle words without fail every single day. It's gotten to the point where, and I do this myself, right? Like, I'm guilty of this. I could be speaking with someone, they're actually in front of me. We're having a conversation, but the conversation isn't going as fast as I want it to, and I need some other sort of input. I need another stimulus, so I'll take my phone out, and then someone else texted me, so now I'm focusing on that. I'm pretending that I'm focusing on this other person that's speaking to me. I'm having this conversation, trying to maintain that. I'm having this other conversation with my phone as well. And we all do this, right? And we've lost sight of what it is that we're doing. We've lost sight of how much we're actually speaking in a day. I want to hone in on this one particular point. That's the last one here, which is about inappropriate advice. Sometimes giving someone advice is wrong. If no one has asked for your opinion, don't offer it. That's kind of a basic tenet of the spiritual life. And if you have this kind of a conversation with your spiritual guide, and I hope that you all have found a spiritual guide, someone that you can really trust, and not just someone that is, like a layman that's your age that you feel like you could just go and kind of speak to. They can be laymen. That's not an issue, but you really have to choose them very, very wisely, right? Usually they're priests, but not always. If you're not qualified to give advice, don't. I see this happen so much with our youth, with people that are in their teens or their 20s. They ask each other for advice all the time. And most everyone gives their opinion, even if they know little to nothing about the topic, instead of just saying, I don't know. And that happens a lot. It happens like you can go and ask someone, what's your opinion on anything political, for example. If you've read one article or you read a headline for 3 seconds, suddenly you're the expert and you know exactly what it is that's happening. You can do this on Facebook with everybody that's going online and talking about all kinds of things on Facebook, whether it's political or it's church oriented or something like this. Everyone has an opinion, and these opinions can be formed so rapidly, right? So you don't even know what the issue is. Someone comes and they tell you the issue for 15 seconds, and suddenly you are God's gift to mankind. You know exactly what it is that's going to happen, and you have perfect discernment of the desert fathers from centuries past, and you're going to be able to guide this person the way that it's supposed to be done. We just don't have that kind of experience, right? And so we should be able to step back and recognize when we don't have that. And this happens especially with relationships, right? Where you won't necessarily know what it is that you're supposed to say. Someone comes and asks you about something that's happening in their relationship. Maybe you're not even married. Maybe you've been married for a very short period of time, something like that. And everything just gets based on whatever knowledge you have that you think is correct. No, you should do this. Don't do this. Avoid this person. Don't text this person back right now. Let them boil for a little. Do this. Whatever kind of advice that we come up with. And that kind of advice is harmful, right? Inappropriate advice is a big deal. And it's not something that we're always conscious of, right? Christ himself in the Gospel of Luke, he says, can the blind lead the blind? Shall they not both fall into the ditch? And it's something that, maybe we'll hear that verse like a deacon reads it in the middle of the gospel at church. And we'll say like, oh yeah, that image definitely makes sense. But that's not me, right? That's other people. Those are the people on the other side of the political spectrum. Those are the ones that are blind. Or those are the people that haven't read what I've read from a church standpoint. I know what I'm talking about. I've read a lot. So I know that I should be able to speak on this. Those people, they don't know what they're talking about. Those are just blind people leading the blind, right? This happens everywhere. And for some reason, we all think that we've become an expert at everything at the age of 14. And we all have something to say, whether it's spiritual issues or relationships. Which one of us just goes to a trusted source, a trusted older source that has experience, when you could just ask your friend very, very quickly, right? Saint Arsenios, this is his icon here. Everyone knows the saying. If you don't, it's a very powerful one. He says, many times have I spoken and regretted it, but I have never regretted silence, right? Try to train yourself to be quiet. Take some time off during the day, even if it's 30 minutes, where you're not speaking to anyone, you're not speaking on the phone, you're not texting anyone intentionally, right? It's not like, oh, everybody else is asleep, therefore now this is my quiet time. No, take some time aside where you can say to yourself, I'm not going to say anything right now. And it doesn't have to be, the sort of over the top kind of thing where, someone comes and asks you for advice, or they ask you like, hey, what do you want to eat later on today? You just keep your mouth shut. You say like, oh, I'm practicing my silence right now. I'm not going to say anything. That kind of stuff will infuriate people, right? Be wise, be discerning about what it is that you're doing. There's a church mother, a desert mother, whose name is Ama Syncletica, who's a giant in our church that we don't really speak very much about. She's amazing. She has this saying that's right on this point. She says, it is dangerous for anyone to teach who has not been first trained in the practical life. For if someone who owns a ruined house receives guests there, he does them harm because of the dilapidation of his dwelling. It is the same in the case of someone who has not first built an interior dwelling. He causes loss to those who come. By words, one may convert them to salvation, but by evil behavior one injures them, right? So be mindful. It's so important for us to be able to see if we're in a position, if we're honest with ourselves, am I in a position to be able to give advice? Am I in a position to be able to teach? If someone has asked me to do it, and I've already had this kind of a conversation with them, and they're trusted, and in their wisdom, they're asking me to do this, then do it, right? But quite often that's not the case. You should be very careful about when it is that you open your mouth about anything, even if you think that you're the expert. Just because you've exposed yourself to a number of things, or you've read books, or you've been even in relationships yourself, you should see where it is that that's coming from, and whether or not your house is in order first before you invite others in. Sins of smell. This is the fourth one. This has become more and more common now because companies have become much, much better at formulating perfumes and colognes. The sense of smell is such a powerful sense. If you guys know neuroscience, you'll know that this is the sense of smell is actually cranial nerve number one, as the shortest nerve from the sense of smell itself to where it is that it's processed in your brain. It is immediate with the way that this kind of stuff can get processed. And I'm sure that you guys have experienced this so many times in your lives, right? Where for me, for example, when we'd visit Egypt when we were kids, and then you learn what the smell of Egypt is like in Cairo, right? Like, you know what the smell is, and then you come back here, and then randomly you'll just be walking one day, and that smell hits you. You just smell that somewhere, and suddenly you're taken back to Egypt in your mind, right? It happens so quickly, and this happens with all kinds of things, foods, and this. But it also happens with lust, right? You can smell something that smells really good. You can smell something that's on someone that's really good. And immediately your mind goes to that, right? The same thing happens when we smell really delicious foods, and especially now at this time during Lent, when you're fasting and you're walking by any of those places that pumps the smell of the food outside, and you smell it, and suddenly you're in agony for a few minutes because you wish that you could have that thing and you're just not having it, right? Lots of people spend a lot of time on smelling good. The sense of smell is very powerful, like I said. And the same thing goes for food. Rather than directing your thoughts towards the smell itself, think of what the sense of smell was meant for, what it is that we can use it for. This image that I have here is the image of the sinful woman who came in to anoint Christ's feet with the costly spikenard. And you could see that what it is that she had was very, very expensive perfume that would be used so that she could attract men. That was the point of it. And she knew that that was the point of it, right? She took this and she offered it to God. She went to anoint Christ. And she did it, and she cried while she was doing it. We know that, right? Because he even says, right? She hasn't stopped wetting my feet with her tears and wiping them away with her hair, right? Everything that she had that could be directed towards someone else, towards attracting somebody else in an inappropriate fashion, whatever it is that that might be, everything that she had, she offered that to God instead, right? And that's how we should try to position ourselves as well. Finally, it's the sins of touch. And this encompasses lust and inappropriate hugs and the touching of oneself. Touch can drive you to lust in half of a blink of an eye. Sit next to someone on a bus when you're going on a trip, or when everyone is piling into their cars so that you guys can go to eat after church, and notice how your whole thought process becomes overtaken by this one touch. And notice then how it is that you'll then try to position yourself so that that stuff starts happening again accidentally, right? So that this is all that's consuming your mind. how is it that I can make this touch happen again, right? Because it's so driven by lust. Touch is a very, very powerful thing that we don't really consider very much. Hugs are very big in our culture, right? Everyone gets a hug now. I'm not saying that it's always wrong. But again, you should be wary of when it is that you're doing it, right? If you're hugging a person because you actually do want to have the sense of touch that's related to lust, then understand that your motivation isn't purely just to say hi to someone. Similarly, understand that you doing that to someone else might make them fall into these kinds of thoughts. So if you say to yourself, well, I don't have that kind of warfare with this particular person or whatever, I'm just going to go up and say hi, and do that. Recognize that you might be putting someone else into a position that they don't want to be in necessarily, or that you're bringing on a warfare onto them. Now, you might think to yourself, well, I'm not responsible for what it is that I'm doing to other people, because that's their own thought process. That's their own warfare. That doesn't have to do with me. But that is a very foolish thing to say, because insofar as we have that discernment in our mind to be able to say, I just won't walk out in front of everybody without a shirt on, because I don't want that to happen for them. I should similarly not do these kinds of things either, right? Whether they're hugs or any kind of this touching or whatever. And it doesn't even have to be that explicit. This thing can happen with a handshake, right? You could go up to someone. So if if you're trying to toe the line here again, and you say like, okay, well, I won't do the hug, but I'll just go up and I'll give them a handshake. And you hold this person's hand, and you hold it for just a second longer than what it is that it should be. Suddenly there's this unspoken understanding that's happened between the two people, right? That lingering for just 1 second. That's the sin of touch, right? That's one of the sins of touch. And it's something that we have to be aware of, right? Finally, this last one, which is an awkward one to speak about, especially because for many of you, this is the first time that you guys have met me. And so this is a very awkward conversation to have with people. Regardless, it has to be covered, because this is one of the things that happens even when we're not touching anybody else, right? Our bodies are so sensitive to this thing, and it's such a rampant problem for so many of us. And it's not just a problem for men. This is a problem for males and females, and that should be known, right? It should be known, because if we're only seeking out help for one gender and we're not doing it for the other, then we're not really doing a service here, right? You should be aware of when it is that these kinds of lustful thoughts can come to you and what spurs them on, right? Sometimes it's that you're staying up too late at night and no one else is around, and that's where it comes from. Or you're just bumming it out in the middle of the day, and you're like, oh, I'm too tired to do anything. I don't really want to watch TV, and suddenly that thought comes to mind, right? These are the things that there's always sort of a path that they'll take. There's a pattern that develops, and these patterns establish themselves. That after a while you can recognize them, especially if you're very discerning and if you're open with someone that you really trust to be able to speak to about this, especially in confession, someone that you really, really trust, right? To be able to say, this is, generally the pattern that develops, and try to head that off before it even happens, right? When you see that that's happening, when you say like, it's the middle of the day and I'm just kind of bumming it out, I might have to leave, right? I have to leave my house. I'll go and be in the presence of other people, or I'll try to find something else to do. It's these kinds of things. It's these kinds of patterns that become so important for us to be able to recognize, and why it is that having a spiritual guide can be very useful, because they can point out these kinds of things for us, so that we can see where in the battle we can cut it off before it becomes too much of an issue. Again, in summary here, the 5 senses that we have, our ability to be able to interact with the world at large, are not evil things. They weren't given to us as evil. It's not like, we weren't supposed to have the sense of sight or touch or smell or taste or any of these things. These things were all given to us so that we can find God, in his creation, so that we could find God in being able to glorify him by looking around, by smelling, by tasting the things that he's given us, and giving glory to him, not being involved in these things themselves, right? When our minds are only here on the world, when our focus is only here, it's only the pleasures of the world, it's only our being able to fill ourselves from that standpoint, then it's misguided. And that's what sin is, right? So we could go through and we could come up with 300 sins for each of the senses that we've covered here, but it's not meant to be a catalog of sins that we're going through. The point of it is supposed to be that we can see if something is not directed towards God, then it's not the purest that it can be, because that's what it is that is supposed to be. When I look at somebody, I'm supposed to see Christ in them. When I smell something, I'm supposed to be able to glorify God for being able to give me that sense of smell. And this can apply for all kinds of things, right? Even the sense of touch. The sense of touch is something that could be so comforting for us when we're really in need, right? When you need someone there because you're going through something that is such a negative part of your life, and they're there so that they can like tab alaykum, or just be there so that they can comfort you. That intrinsically has something that's so beautiful to it. And we've seen even in studies, in medical studies, that touch is so important between a mother and her child, that if a child isn't touched, the child has a very high likelihood of dying if they're not touched. So you can feed the kid and you can give them all the oxygen that they need and all of that stuff, but if they don't have that touch, they might actually die. And so that's something that was given to us so that we can see that importance. If there's that kind of a development between a mother and their child, towards a parent and their child, how much more is that so that we can recognize God in that kind of a relationship, in that kind of an interaction? We should be constantly trying to strive to see that. And so be mindful of what it is that you're letting into any of these senses, so that the windows aren't just open for everything, that we are trying to discern Christ in our lives every step of the day. And glory be to God forever. Amen. Questions? I don't know if I went too long on you guys.
No, not at all, Peter. Thank you very much. I got Monica has her hand up.
Sure.
Monica Beverly. Maybe not.
It was very Hi guys, so sorry. I sent you a direct message. I'm actually out in public.
No worries. Did you send it to Peter?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Let me see. I'll bring that up. Okay. So this question says, what if you're jealous and you're triggered by desire, not anger? It's the same thing, right? So I think this was asked around the time when we were speaking about envy. Envy and jealousy are two separate things. So envy is seeing that someone else has something and being upset that they have it. And jealousy could be that you are lacking in something and you simply just want that thing. So that could be independent of another person having it. You could be jealous over things, and that could be appropriate and that can be inappropriate. There's a good jealousy. There's obviously like a godly jealousy, which is why it is that we have these things to begin with, which is why it is that we have these kinds of desires that are in us. All of these things, that the negative things that we talk about, like pride, anger, lust, envy, gluttony, avarice, sloth, all of these things that we consider to be either the 7 deadly sins or the 8 passions, however it is that you want to characterize them, they're all things that we're supposed to be guided towards God. They're supposed to lead us towards him. And once we start directing them towards other people or other objects and not God himself, that's what it is that we consider to be sin. And it's not sin because it's like a coin of a sin that gets deposited in your box that is considered to be sin. It's a sin because our whole being is supposed to be directed towards God. And so when you see that you have a desire for something that isn't leading you towards that, and it's done so from an inappropriate fashion, that's what it is that we would call sin. I don't know if that clarifies things. You have a second part here. You say, you're happy for the person and what blessing they have, but you still have a desire for something better. How is this something we get over? Well, again, I mean, it depends on what it is that we're talking about, right? So if, for example, like when I was a kid and I saw that my older sister was getting really good grades, I also wanted really good grades, right? I wanted really good grades, not only for the fact that she was getting good grades, but because I could see how my parents were reacting with her and the kind of effect, the happiness that she had within herself, the feeling that she was able to study and achieve something that was there. And I wanted that too. That could be a good thing, right? There's things that can motivate us that way as well. So that if you wanted to be go into a particular profession, or you're working towards having something like a particular goal, you want to buy a house or something like that. Again, that's not intrinsically wrong. That might be good motivation, right? I, for example, was taught that I should be able to support myself and someone else before I got married. That's just how my parents taught me. That's not something that applies for everybody. That's just how my parents taught me. And so my motivation for being able to get to that next stage in life was to be able to do that, right? To be able to study and work hard and do all of that so that I'd be able to do that. That can be a godly motivation, because what you're trying to do is something good, is realizing what the will of God is in your life. And so those things can be good. It's not the thing itself, right? So whatever it is that the object of your affection is here that you want, that in itself is not a bad thing or a good thing. It's the reason that you want it and why it is that you're working towards that. So for example, an iPhone, right? Some people want iPhones because they're status symbols, or at least they used to be. I don't know how people consider them now. I assume that they still are. But they're like status symbols, right? So someone has an iPhone and you see someone that has it. I remember when I was in college, people would have these kinds of earbuds. And so if you were walking around with these white earbuds, everybody knew that you had an iPhone, right? Now it's the AirPods that people walk around with. And if you're using them for something that's good, right? So that you're using them for your service, or you're being able to stay in touch with your family when things are important, or that kind of thing, or if you're using your phone so that so that you could serve people, so that you can continue to read the Bible during the day, so that you can read books that are there and not just waste your time on other things, like wasting your time on inordinate amounts of time that are spent on Facebook or Instagram or these kinds of things. It's good to be able to have these things if you're using them for the right purpose. And that applies for a whole swath of things, which is why even when it comes to something like jealousy, it really depends on which way it's being directed. And that, again, applies for all of the passions or the deadly sins, however it is that you want to categorize them. Does that kind of make sense?
Awesome. Yes, it does. Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
So if you like
I think I heard someone else that was asking something, but I don't know if they were talking to me.
No, I think that was Monica's microphone picking it up.
Got it. Other questions? Nothing else. I've put you all to sleep, which is wonderful.
I had a question, Peter.
Yes, sir.
The eye being, as you mentioned, probably one of the most prominent gateways into the mind and into the heart, especially in our current age. Maybe we can just bullet point a few practical kind of exercises that can help provide some self-control and practical kind of techniques to help us minimize or reduce the impact and of the eye specifically?
I'll tell you, I mean, one of the things that Abuna said in the book was, if you see something and you weren't intending on seeing it, delete it from your mind as quickly as possible. I think that would be nice if we were able to do that all the time. I know that that's clearly not the case, that we're able to put that into effect whenever it is that we want to. And so what I would say is, look towards things that are good often, so that when things that are bad come up, you still have something in mind that's good, right? And so surround yourself with things that are good. So, for example, in your house, and again, maybe people will consider this kind of stuff to be either basic or childish, or you feel like it's not really going to the point of it. But surrounding ourselves with icons of the saints are really important, right? And they're important for many different reasons. Being able to see people that were able to do this kind of a struggle and look towards them as role models for that is very useful. Being able to feel like, and I really do mean this, feel like you're being watched, so that, you know, if you're at home and you feel like there are actually other people that are around, it's very useful. And I think that is a very practical thing. And then unfortunately, even with that, there will be people that will fall to the side, even with that kind of thing around, because none of us are going to be perfect in being able to overcome these things with any of the little tricks that we might be able to cite off here. But like I was saying, by putting in front of you, by putting in front of your eyes, good, holy things, so that instead of spending your time on things that you feel even are neutral, right? On Facebook or texting with your friends or something like this, put something good in front of you, right? Read the Bible. And it's not like you have to, I'm not saying that you have to go read the Bible for 18 hours a day or just stare at the saints or do something like that. But these images that are around us, just as we have images that would come into our subconscious once we see them that are from the negative standpoint, the same thing happens from the positive standpoint as well. To go beyond that would probably require a little bit more depth in what is trying to be avoided here. So like going a little bit more in detail in terms of the question itself and towards our own personal standpoints and our struggles. It's very hard to be able to come out especially with something like pornography, for example, and be able to give one answer that is, you know, definitive for everybody in order for them to be able to struggle against this appropriately. It's tough. It's a really hard one that, again, like I said before, is very pervasive in our culture now. And because it's so easily accessible in our pockets, it's become really an issue. And so for me to be able to say something like just do this and then suddenly that will go away, it probably won't, because it's very challenging. But our spiritual life is not determined, and maybe this is where we can have some hope. Our spiritual lives are not determined by how successful we are in being able to overcome these things every single time that we come across them, right? The fathers of the church, they say, what makes a saint is not how many times he falls, it's how quickly he rises up, right? And so we know that we are going to fall into some of these things. I'm not saying that so that it just gives us free license to be able to do whatever it is that we want. But the thing that is the strength of our spirituality is how it is that we emerge from that, how quickly we can stand up from that. And that should give us hope, because God really is on our side. He's not just standing there and watching us, you know, toil and burn and wants to see how it is that we're going to be doing in these situations. He really is there trying to call us towards him, even in the midst of that, even when we're falling on the floor itself.
Thank you.
I don't know if that was of any use or practicality whatsoever, but it's a tough one. It takes a lot of discernment and a real personal touch to it.
Yeah, and it's given the amount of times we do fall, it'll likely be a long journey of
Right.
getting back onto the straight and narrow. I see George is on here with us today. George as our Amin Khidma, and Nancy as well, and just opening the floor to them to see if they have any added comments or questions?
Yeah, hi, Steve. Thank you very much, Peter. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
No, I don't have any questions. I enjoyed the talk very much. I think it's applicable to people across many generations, not just the youth.
Indeed.
So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Thanks, George. Can you lead us in closing prayer, Peter?
Sure. In the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Lord, we thank you for allowing us to gather together today in fellowship and in unity with one another. Allow us to continue through our path here through Lent, so that we might be supported by your grace and support one another through the intercessions of the Holy Virgin Mary Theotokos, through the prayers of Saint Macarius and all your angels and saints. Hear us, O God, when we call upon you, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our